Rain fell over Red Mill like the town was trying to wash away an old memory. Retired Navy SEAL Ethan Cole had come home only to bury the past and sell his father's house. Beside him sat Ranger, a gray-muzzled German shepherd who still remembered the smell of smoke. Then, outside a forgotten nursing home, the old dog suddenly froze. A thin line of smoke curled from an upstairs window, and somewhere inside, someone was still knocking. Ethan did not know the trapped man was the firefighter who had once saved his father's life. Before the sirens arrived, one command changed everything. Find him. Subscribe so you don't miss the next story of loyalty, courage, and hope. Rain had a way of making old towns look as if they were remembering something. It softened the brick storefronts along Main Street, blurred the gold letters on the barber shop window, and turned the blacktop road into a long strip of trembling light. Red Mill, Pennsylvania, had not changed enough to comfort Ethan Cole, and it had not changed enough to let him pretend he was a stranger. The town still sat low between the wooded hills, huddled around its church steeple, firehouse, and cemetery, like an old family around a kitchen table. The October rain fell thin and cold. It tapped on the windshield of Ethan's old pickup with the patient fingers of someone who had waited years to speak. Ethan drove with both hands on the wheel. He was 56 years old, though age sat on him differently than it did on most men. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and solid through the chest, with the straight-backed posture of someone who had spent half his life entering rooms before fear did. His dark brown hair was cut short and clean, touched with gray at the temples. A day or two of trimmed stubble shadowed his jaw. His face was square, sun-browned at the forehead and neck, and quiet in the way heavy doors were quiet. On his left wrist, beneath the cuff of his olive field jacket, he wore his father's old Hamilton watch. He had nearly left it in the drawer that morning. Then, at the last moment, he had taken it out, wound it twice, and fastened it around his wrist, like a punishment he had chosen for himself. Beside him, in the passenger seat, Ranger lifted his head. The German shepherd was 9 years old, big through the shoulders, black-backed with deep copper legs and a silvering muzzle. His right ear stood clean and sharp. His left carried a small V-shaped tear near the edge, a little flag of old violence. He wore a dark leather collar with a scratched metal shield hanging from it. Find one more. The words were nearly worn smooth. Ranger watched the road with solemn amber eyes. Now and then, his nose twitched when the wind pushed rain through the truck's old vents. He had once worked search and rescue in collapsed buildings, flood zones, and burned-out shells where people had run out of air before they ran out of hope. He had found living hands under concrete. He had found silence under ash. And once he had not found the person in time. Since then, smoke and sirens lived under his skin. Ethan understood that. A man did not have to be a dog to carry sounds no one else could hear. "You're all right," Ethan said quietly. Ranger did not look at him. He only blinked once, slow and old. Ethan almost smiled. "Convincing performance." The dog gave the smallest breath through his nose, as if to say he had heard worse lies from better men. Red Mill's welcome sign passed on the right, half hidden behind wet maple branches. The paint had faded since Ethan had last seen it. The mill wheel on the sign, once bright red, had gone the color of dried blood. "Welcome to Red Mill, a town that remembers." Ethan's thumb moved to the watch before he could stop it. The town remembered. That was the trouble. It remembered Thomas Cole standing in a police uniform outside the diner, buying black coffee and pretending the pie was for someone else. It remembered Ethan at 17, too serious for his own face, carrying football pads under one arm and telling everyone he was leaving the second he could. It remembered the winter fire on Mercer Street, the night Thomas Cole went into a burning house after a trapped child and came out alive only because another man had gone into the flames after him. A firefighter, his father had always said. Never a name. Just a firefighter. When Ethan was young, the story had seemed simple. His father had been brave. Another man had been braver. Everyone survived who mattered to the boy Ethan had been. Only later did he understand that survival was not the end of a fire. Sometimes it was only the part people applauded before going home. Thomas had carried smoke in his lungs the rest of his life. Not enough to stop him from working. Not enough to make him complain. Just enough to cough in the mornings. To pause halfway upstairs. To press one hand against the kitchen counter when he thought Ethan was not looking. Ethan had not looked enough. That was the stone in his chest tonight. He had returned to Red Mill for his father's memorial service, a small gathering planned by the church and the few old officers still alive to remember Thomas Cole as more than a name on a brass plaque. Ethan had told himself he would attend, shake hands, nod at stories, sleep one night in the old house, and then call the real estate agent. The house would sell quickly. Old oak floors, 2 acres behind it, a good roof after Ethan paid to repair the back slope. A house like that deserved someone who knew how to stay. The windshield wipers dragged across the glass with a tired groan. Ranger shifted. Ethan glanced over. What? The dog's ears had lifted. His body had gone still in that sudden, complete way that always made Ethan's nerves sharpen. Ranger was not looking at the road ahead now. He was looking out the passenger window into the dark beyond the shoulder. Deer? No response. The truck rolled past the cemetery road. Ethan saw the black iron fence, the leaning stones, the pale shapes of flowers gone limp in the rain. His father was buried somewhere beyond the gate under a modest stone that read, Thomas Cole Father, Officer, Steadfast Friend. Ethan had chosen the words by phone. He had not been there when the stone was placed. Ranger gave a low growl, not a warning growl, not yet. A memory growl. Ethan slowed the truck. On the left, beyond a row of bare sycamores, stood St. Bartholomew Nursing Home. It was a long, 3-story brick building with a chapel wing on one end and a covered entry sagging slightly under the rain. The sign out front still bore the image of a saint with one hand raised in blessing. Though the light inside the sign flickered so badly, the saint seemed to be waving for help. Ethan had passed the place once or twice as a boy. Back then, it had been a convent school, if he remembered right. Later, someone bought it, renamed it, and filled it with the elderly after their families ran out of bedrooms, patients, or both. Ranger rose from the seat. His nails scraped the vinyl. Easy, Ethan said. The dog pressed his nose toward the cracked window seam and inhaled sharply. Then he barked. Once, deep, hard. Urgent. Ethan felt it more than heard it. The bark struck the inside of the cab like a fist on a door. He pulled onto the shoulder. Rain ticked on the roof. The engine idled. For a second, nothing moved except the wipers and Ranger's ribs. Talk to me, Ethan murmured. Ranger barked again, then clawed at the door. Ethan looked through the windshield at the nursing home. At first, all he saw was rain, dim windows, a porch light twitching in the wind. Then a pale thread slid from an upper window near the far end of the building. Not fog, smoke. Thin, gray, almost polite. The kind of smoke people dismissed until it had already chosen its victims. Ethan's hand went still on the gear shift. Inside him, Something old and trained woke without asking permission. Not panic. Panic wasted time. What rose in Ethan was colder, cleaner, and far less forgiving. He turned off the engine. Ranger was trembling now, but not from fear alone. His body leaned toward the building, every muscle caught between obedience and instinct. Ethan could hear the faintest sound through the rain. A fire alarm, weak, distant, wrong. It did not roar. It chirped and flickered, like a dying bird caught somewhere inside the walls. For one moment, Ethan saw his father's kitchen instead of the nursing home. Thomas sitting at the table in a flannel shirt, coughing into a folded handkerchief, waving Ethan away when he asked if he was all right. Just smoke left over, son. Smoke never left over, Ethan thought. Smoke waited. He stepped out into the rain. Cold air hit his face. Ranger shoved toward him from inside the cab, but Ethan held the door with one hand. "Stay," he said. Ranger did not stay. He could not leave the truck until Ethan gave permission. But his eyes locked on the upper floor so fiercely that Ethan turned to follow the line of his gaze. The smoke came from a window at the far end of the second floor, barely visible behind a crooked gutter. Below it, on the front lawn, several elderly residents were gathered in confusion under the dripping porch roof. One man sat in a wheelchair wearing only a bathrobe over pajamas, rain beating on his bald head. An old woman clutched a stuffed cat to her chest and cried without sound. Another resident kept asking where her shoes were, and near the front steps, a young woman in pale blue scrubs was trying to push 2 wheelchairs at once. She could not have been more than 24. Her brown blonde hair had come loose from a low ponytail, and wet strands stuck to her cheek. A gray cardigan clung to her shoulders. Her name badge swung sideways from the pocket of her scrubs as she hurried from one resident to another. "Ma'am," Ethan called. She turned fast, eyes wide with exhaustion and fear. I'm sorry. Are you family?" she asked, already breathless. "No. What's burning?" Her face changed at the question. Not because she knew the answer, but because someone had finally asked the right thing. "The utility room, maybe laundry, I don't know. The panel sparked and then the alarm started acting up. We're trying to get everyone out, but..." She looked back at the building. That glance told Ethan more than her words. "How many staff inside?" "2. No, 3, if Mr. Rusk is still in his office." Her voice cracked slightly on the name. "I'm Lily Parker. I'm night care staff. We're short tonight. We're always short. But tonight..." She stopped herself. The old woman with the stuffed cat began to slip sideways in her chair, and Lily caught her by the shoulder. Ethan stepped closer. "Is everyone accounted for?" Lily did not answer quickly enough. The rain grew louder. "Lily," Ethan said, softer now. "Is everyone accounted for?" Her throat moved. "I don't know." Ranger barked from the truck, a sound sharp enough to make the old man in the wheelchair flinch. Lily looked toward the pickup. "Is that your dog?" "Retired search and rescue." Her eyes flicked up to the second floor. "There are residents up there who can't move fast. Some don't hear the alarms. The call buttons on the East Hall have been broken on and off. I told them, I wrote it down. I swear I wrote it down." Ethan heard guilt in her voice. Young guilt. The kind that thought being trapped inside a bad system made you responsible for every bad thing the system did. He knew better. He also knew guilt was useless unless it learned to move. "Which window?" he asked. Lily pointed with a shaking hand toward the far corner. "East Hall, rooms 212 through 216. We moved most of them earlier after dinner because the heat was out in the West Wing. I think Mrs. Agnes is in 214. She can't hear well. Anyone else? I don't, Lily swallowed. Mr. Mallory, Frank Mallory, 216. But his chart says he sleeps through anything and the door sticks. And I was trying to get Mrs. Vale down the stairs. And then... She covered her mouth as if the rest of the sentence might burn her. Ranger hit the inside of the truck door with both front paws. Ethan turned. The dog's amber eyes were no longer on Lily, no longer on the residents, no longer even on the smoke. They were fixed on the upper east window. Then came another sound. Not the alarm, not thunder. A faint metallic tapping from somewhere inside the building. 3 beats. A pause. 3 beats again. Ethan's body went still. In another life, in another dark, men had used pipes, knives, rocks, bone, anything that carried sound to say the same thing. Here. I am here. For the first time that night, the past and the present touched so closely that Ethan could not tell which one had reached for him. His father's watch ticked under his cuff. Ranger whined once, low and desperate. Ethan opened the truck door. The dog dropped to the wet pavement in one controlled motion, not wild, not frantic. His head lowered. His tail came level with his spine. The old K9 in him stepped through the rain like a soldier being handed back a mission he had never truly left. Ethan crouched in front of him and took Ranger's face between both hands. "Listen to me," he said. Ranger held his gaze. Ethan could smell the rain on the dog's fur, the old leather collar, the faint iron scent of the shield tag beneath his fingers. "Find one more." He looked back at St. Bartholomew. The smoke at the upper window thickened, just enough to stop being polite. This was not a battlefield. There were no rifles, no radios calling coordinates, no commander waiting for a report. There was only a failing building, a young caregiver with fear in her eyes, a handful of forgotten elders shivering in the rain, and somewhere above them, a tapping sound that might stop at any moment. Ethan had spent years telling himself he was done entering places other people wanted to escape. But a man did not always choose the shape of his unfinished business. Sometimes it came dressed as smoke. Sometimes it wore his father's watch. Sometimes it barked beside him with silver on its muzzle and an old command scratched into its collar. Lily stepped toward him. "Sir, the fire department is on the way, but I don't know how long." "I know. You can't just... I'm not going in blind." Ethan straightened. His voice remained calm, and somehow that made Lily stop shaking for half a second. "Where are the stairs?" "Side entrance. Left of the chapel wing. The main stairwell has smoke." "Keys." She fumbled at her pocket, hands clumsy from cold and panic. A ring of keys slipped free, almost falling before Ethan caught it. "Stay with them," he said. "Keep everyone away from the doors. If firefighters arrive, tell them East Hall, 2nd floor, possible residents trapped, electrical smoke from utility or laundry. Say it exactly." Lily nodded too quickly, then forced herself to nod again, slower. Ethan looked down at Ranger. The dog was already facing the building. For a breath, Ethan thought of the house he planned to sell, of his father's kitchen, of all the evenings when he had called from far away and said, "I'll come home when things slow down," as if time had ever slowed down for any man who waited politely. He thought of Thomas Cole coughing into a handkerchief. He thought of smoke that never really left. Then Ethan gave the command. "Find him." Ranger surged forward through the rain. Ethan followed, boots splashing across the nursing home lawn, his field jacket darkening under the storm. Behind him, Lily gathered the shivering residents beneath the porch light. Ahead of him, St. Bartholomew loomed with its flickering saint, its dim windows, and its thin gray breath curling into the night. Ethan Cole had returned to Red Mill to bury the last of his father's memory and sell the house that held it. Instead, the town had opened an old door, and from somewhere inside, someone was still knocking. The side entrance opened with a reluctant metal groan. For 1 second, Ethan Cole stood in the doorway with rain at his back and smoke in front of him, and the nursing home seemed to breathe against him. Not burn. Breathe. A slow, bitter exhale rolled along the ceiling and pressed itself into the old hallway. It smelled of melted plastic, wet insulation, overheated wires, and something older beneath it all. Dust that had slept too long inside the walls. The emergency lights blinked red, then dimmed, then blinked again, as if the building could not decide whether to confess or keep pretending. Ranger went in first. He did not charge like a movie dog. He entered low and deliberate, nose working, ears forward, paws careful on the slick linoleum. Ethan followed close, one hand gripping Lily Parker's key ring, the other holding a damp towel he had pulled from a laundry cart near the entrance and pressed loosely over his mouth. The corridor was narrow, lined with framed watercolor prints of barns, covered bridges, and flowers no one in the building had likely seen in years. A wheelchair sat abandoned near a wall. A plastic cup had rolled into the center of the hallway, spilling pale medication tablets that stuck to the wet floor like tiny moons. From the front of the building came Lily's voice, strained but steady. "Mrs. Vale, hold my arm." "No, sweetheart, not that way. This way. We're going outside." The voice helped Ethan more than she knew. It gave shape to the chaos. Someone was still working. Someone was still trying. Ranger paused at a junction, sniffed left, then pulled right toward the chapel wing. Ethan checked the wall-mounted fire map. The plastic cover was cracked. The diagram beneath had faded to pale blue and red lines, but he found the stairwell Lily had mentioned. Side stairs, east hall, second floor. He listened. The alarm chirped again from somewhere above, weak and intermittent. A bad sign. A good alarm forced people to move. A dying alarm gave people permission to hesitate. Ethan had seen that in combat too, though no one called it by that name. Men did not freeze because they were cowards. They froze because the world sent them two messages at once: danger and doubt. Move and wait. Run and stay. Live and obey. At the stairs, Ranger stopped. Smoke pressed down from the second-floor landing, thicker there, but not black. Not yet. Ethan crouched and looked up through the railings. The ceiling above the stairwell still held visibility. Heat was present, but not rolling hard enough to mean open fire nearby. Electrical smoke, spreading from another section. Dangerous, but passable for minutes. Not many. "Easy," Ethan murmured. Ranger glanced back only once, as if offended by the suggestion that he might be anything else. They climbed. On the second-floor landing, the nursing home changed character. Downstairs had been panic. Upstairs was worse. Upstairs was neglect wearing silence. Several doors stood open, rooms emptied in haste. A blanket trailed halfway into the hallway. A walker lay on its side. On one bedside table, visible through an open doorway, a glass of water trembled each time the alarm chirped. The walls were painted a tired cream color that had gone gray at the corners. The ceiling tiles near the far end were stained brown from old leaks. Ranger moved east. He passed room 210 without stopping, then 212, where a television flickered blue over an empty bed. Ethan swept each doorway with a quick look, not entering unless Ranger signaled. That was the bargain between them. Ethan trusted the dog's nose. Ranger trusted Ethan's judgment. Between them, they saved time neither of them owned. Then Ranger stopped hard. Room 214. A soft sound came from inside, not tapping, not the same sound as before. Breathing. Ethan tried the handle, unlocked. Inside, an elderly woman sat rigid in an armchair beside her bed, dressed in a pink nightgown and a knitted sweater, both too thin for the cold. She had white hair pinned unevenly to one side and eyes clouded by confusion. A pair of hearing aids sat useless in a small plastic case on the nightstand. She looked straight at Ethan and did not seem to hear the alarm at all. "Mrs. Agnes," Ethan said. The woman blinked. Ranger crossed to her slowly and placed his muzzle near her hand. She flinched at first, then stared at him as if he had arrived from a kinder century. "Oh," she whispered. The big one came back. Ethan did not know what that meant, and there was no time to ask. He lifted the blanket from the bed, wrapped it around her shoulders, and pointed toward the hall. She looked at his hand, then at his face. Her mouth trembled, not from fear alone, but from the terrible humiliation of not understanding what everyone else had already decided. Ethan softened his voice, though he knew she could barely hear it. "We're getting you out." He held out his arm. Mrs. Agnes reached for him, then stopped. Her fingers touched Ranger's head instead. The dog stood still as a statue. For a moment, in that smoke-stained room, an old woman, a tired dog, and a man who had forgotten how to come home formed a small circle of trust without ceremony. Then the metallic tapping came again. 3 beats, a pause, 3 beats, from the end of the hall. Mrs. Agnes heard none of it, but Ranger did. His head snapped toward room 216. His body changed in an instant. Ethan felt the chapter of the night turn, not louder, not bigger, deeper. There was someone at the end of the hall who was not waiting to be saved by luck. Someone was signaling. Ethan helped Mrs. Agnes into the hallway and guided her toward the landing, where Lily's footsteps were already pounding upward. She appeared through the smoke, face flushed, cardigan soaked from rain and sweat, one hand gripping the rail. "I told the fire department East Hall," she gasped. "They're close. I can hear sirens." "Take her." Lily saw Mrs. Agnes and went pale with relief and fresh shame. "Oh, Agnes, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." The old woman patted Lily's sleeve with the vague forgiveness of someone who did not understand the full danger and perhaps was blessed for it. 216, Ethan said. "Mallory?" Lily nodded, tears gathering but not falling. "Door sticks. It sticks bad. I put in 3 maintenance requests. Go." "But..." "Lily." She looked at him. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The command was not military. It was mercy-given structure. "Get her down!" Lily swallowed, then nodded and took Mrs. Agnes with both hands. Ethan turned before they reached the stairs. Ranger was already at room 216. The door looked ordinary at first glance. Beige paint. Metal number plate. A small laminated name card in a plastic holder. Frank Mallory. Below the name, someone had stuck a faded paper leaf cutout, probably from an autumn activity long past. The words written on it in shaky black marker read, "I miss my firehouse coffee." Ethan stared at that small leaf longer than he should have. It was ridiculous. It was heartbreaking. It was the kind of joke a proud man made when he could no longer choose his own chair, his own meals, his own mornings, but could still defend one tiny corner of himself with humor. Ranger whined. Ethan tried the handle. It turned part way, then stopped. He used one of Lily's keys. The lock clicked, but the door did not open. The frame had swollen, warped by damp and age. From inside came a cough, low and wet, then the scraping sound of something dragged weakly across the floor. "Mr. Mallory," Ethan called. "Can you hear me?" Another cough. Then a voice, thin as burned paper. "Pipe! Wall!" Ethan leaned close to the gap beneath the door. A damp strip of fabric had been jammed along the bottom edge. Towel, maybe. Smart. Very smart. "Frank, I'm getting you out." A pause. "Agnes. She's out." The silence after that was not empty. It was a man allowing himself to use one breath for his own survival. Ethan set his shoulder against the door and pushed. Nothing. He backed up one step and drove his boot near the latch. The impact cracked the old frame but did not break it. Ranger stood back, tense but disciplined, eyes fixed on the gap where smoke curled at floor level. Ethan kicked again. Wood split. Inside, something fell. "Frank?" No answer. A sharper thread of smoke slid into the hall. Ethan could hear sirens now, real ones this time, coming closer through the rain. Good. Too late for the man inside if Ethan waited. He kicked a third time, lower, where the swollen frame had trapped the door. The jam gave with a sound like a bone snapping. The door burst inward several inches, then jammed against something behind it. A chair. Ethan forced his arm through the gap, shoved the chair aside, and pushed in. The room beyond was dim, smoky, and small. Frank Mallory lay half on his side near the bed, one hand still gripping a wooden cane. He wore a brown cardigan over a dark flannel shirt, both wrinkled and damp from his efforts. His white hair was flattened to his scalp. His face was long and hollow, the cheekbones sharp beneath skin gone gray with smoke. But his eyes were open, faded blue, angry at his body for failing him. In the corner, near the baseboard heater, lay the metal pipe he must have struck with his cane. On the floor by the door was the wet towel he had used to block the smoke. A plastic water pitcher had been emptied beside it. This man had not waited helplessly. He had fought with the few tools left to him. Ethan crossed the room and crouched. "Frank Mallory?" The old man stared at him, trying to focus. "Not priest," Frank rasped. "No. Good." "Hi." A terrible little smile pulled at one corner of his mouth. "Owe him money." Despite the smoke, despite the urgency, Ethan almost laughed, not because it was funny enough, but because it was alive. Ranger came in slowly and lowered his head. Frank's gaze shifted to the dog. Something in his face changed. The fear did not vanish. Pain did not vanish. But recognition, or something close to it, moved through him like a coal stirred under ash. "Rescue dog," he whispered. "Retired," Ethan said. Frank's fingers twitched. Ranger stepped closer, not to pull, not to command. He placed his muzzle gently against the old man's wrist. Frank's hand settled on the dog's head. For a heartbeat, the room was no longer room 216 at St. Bartholomew. It was every burning hallway Frank had ever entered, every helmet knocked crooked by falling plaster, every living hand found under smoke. It was the old brotherhood of those who went toward danger not because they had no fear, but because someone else had more. Then Frank's eyes sharpened again. 214, he rasped. "She's safe," Ethan said. "Sure?" "Yes." Frank closed his eyes. It was not relief exactly. It was permission. Ethan slid one arm behind Frank's shoulders and another under his knees. The old man was shockingly light. Too light. A man should not be able to lose so much weight and still carry such a history. "Ranger, out!" The dog backed into the hall, then turned to lead. Ethan lifted Frank. Pain tore a sound from the old man's throat, But he bit it down quickly, pride still standing guard even when the body could not. "Sorry," Ethan said. Frank's eyelids fluttered. "For what?" "Hurting you." Another ghost of a smile. "Son, I've been married, burned, and fed hospital meatloaf. You'll have to do better." This time, Ethan did laugh, one short breath through the towel. The hallway had worsened. Smoke now gathered lower, milky and hot around the ceiling lights. Ethan stayed crouched as much as he could while carrying Frank, following Ranger's black back toward the stairs. At the landing, Lily reappeared below, looking up from the first-floor hallway. "Here," she called. "This way." Behind her, 2 firefighters came through the main entrance in turnout gear, helmets shining under the emergency lights. The first was young but moved with practiced authority, his face partly hidden beneath his helmet brim. He had broad hands, rain on his yellow coat, and eyes that seemed to count people before they saw walls. "Second floor," Lily shouted. "One coming down!" The firefighter looked up, then he froze. Not long, just long enough for Ethan to notice. "Mallory," the firefighter said. Frank's head shifted weakly against Ethan's shoulder. The firefighter bounded up the first few steps, then stopped to give Ethan room. "I've got him," Ethan said. The younger man nodded, though his expression had changed from procedure to disbelief. "I'm Captain Caleb Dorsey, Red Mill Fire. Hand him to us at the bottom." "Agnes out?" "She's outside with EMS." Frank heard the name and made the smallest sound. Not words. Enough. Ethan descended one step at a time. Ranger kept close, occasionally glancing back to ensure the slow procession had not broken. Caleb and another firefighter helped guide them down the last turn of the stairs. The moment they reached the first floor, the air widened. Cold rain pushed through the open entry. Sirens washed the walls red and white. Voices overlapped. EMS calling for oxygen. Firefighters asking about the utility room. Lily counting residents under her breath like a prayer. Ethan transferred Frank to a waiting stretcher just outside the front doors. The old man's body began to shiver violently once the night air touched him. An EMT wrapped him in a silver thermal blanket. Oxygen was placed over his nose and mouth. Frank tried to push it away with weak irritation, but Ranger stepped closer and rested his head near the old man's knee. Frank stopped fighting. Caleb Dorsey removed his helmet. He was younger than Ethan had expected, early 30s maybe, with rain-dark hair, a square jaw, and the stunned expression of a man who had just seen a name from the firehouse wall breathe in front of him. "Frank Mallory," Caleb said quietly. The EMT looked up. "You know him?" Caleb swallowed. "Every kid in our station knows him." Frank's eyes cracked open. "Then tell them," he murmured behind the oxygen. "I looked taller in the pictures." A few people nearby laughed softly, the way people laugh when fear has not yet left, but needs somewhere to go. Caleb crouched beside the stretcher, his voice lowered. "Sir, you trained Chief Dorsey, my father. He still tells the story about the church fire." Frank blinked at him, trying to place the lineage. "Dorsey's boy." "Yes, sir." Frank's gaze drifted toward the nursing home, where smoke continued to leak from the upper window and firefighters moved in purposeful lines beneath the rain. "Place always smelled wrong," Frank whispered. Caleb's face tightened. Ethan heard it. So did Lily, standing a few feet away with her arms wrapped around herself. She looked smaller now that the immediate terror had passed. Not less brave, just more aware of what had nearly happened. Ranger shifted and laid his head fully across Frank's knees. The old man's hand emerged from beneath the silver blanket, trembling. His fingers found the torn edge of Ranger's left ear and stroked it with the gentleness of a man greeting a fellow veteran. "You went in," Frank said. Ranger remained still. Frank's eyes moved to Ethan then, not quite focused but searching. "He yours?" "Mostly," Ethan said. Frank's mouth twitched under the oxygen tube. "Dogs belong to the job first." Ethan looked at Ranger, then at the smoke, then at the old firefighter under the blanket. "Maybe some men do too." Frank studied him for a second longer, as if something in Ethan's voice had caught on an old hook inside his memory. Then his hand settled again on Ranger's head. "Good dog," Frank whispered. "You ever run through smoke before?" Ranger answered by closing his eyes and leaning closer. The rain fell around them. The saint on the nursing home sign flickered behind the drifting smoke. Firefighters carried equipment through the doors. Lily guided another resident toward the EMS tent. Caleb stood beside the stretcher, still looking at Frank as if a statue from his childhood had stepped down from its pedestal and turned out to be cold, thin, and nearly forgotten. Ethan remained near the foot of the stretcher, breathing hard now that he no longer needed to pretend he wasn't. The rescue had lasted only minutes, but something about those minutes had altered the night. Frank Mallory was alive. Mrs. Agnes was alive. Ranger stood between them and the ruined entrance like a tired guardian with rain shining on his silver muzzle. And Ethan, who had returned to Red Mill to settle the past quickly and leave before it could ask anything more of him, understood with a quiet weight in his chest that the town was not finished speaking. Not yet. By the time Frank Mallory reached Red Mill Community Hospital, the rain had softened into a silver mist. The emergency entrance glowed under a row of fluorescent lights, too white and too honest for the hour. Ambulance doors opened. Rubber wheels clattered over wet pavement. Someone called for oxygen. Someone else asked for blankets. The night that had been chaos at St. Bartholomew became something more orderly here, but not gentler. Hospitals had their own kind of weather. Cold air, hard floors, voices trying not to sound afraid. Ethan Cole stood near the sliding doors, wet from shoulders to boots, watching the stretcher disappear down the hall. He had smoke in his throat and grit under his fingernails. His field jacket smelled like the inside of a burned wall. Beside him, Ranger remained standing, head high, eyes fixed on the direction Frank had gone. "You did good," Ethan said. Ranger did not wag his tail. The dog's body was present, but his mind had followed the old firefighter. A nurse in navy scrubs approached Ethan with a clipboard and the tired authority of someone who had learned to sort panic into categories. "Sir, are you family?" "No." "Were you exposed to smoke?" "Some." That answer earned him a look. "Sit down. Someone will check you." "I'm fine." She looked from Ethan to Ranger, then back again. "That is what every man says right before he falls over and scares my interns." Ethan almost smiled. Almost. Before he could answer, a woman came from behind the nurse's station with a stethoscope around her neck, and her gray-streaked dark hair pulled into a practical knot. She was in her late 40s or early 50s, compact and steady, with eyes that had seen enough pain to stop wasting time on drama. Her white coat was unbuttoned over green scrubs, and one sleeve was rolled higher than the other as if she had dressed while already moving. "Let him stand if he needs to stand," she said to the nurse. "But put a pulse oximeter on him before his pride writes checks his lungs can't cash." The nurse handed Ethan a small plastic clip. The woman offered him a brief nod. "Mara Winslow, ER physician." "Ethan Cole." Her eyes sharpened at the last name. Not with recognition exactly, but with the small pause of someone from a small town placing a family tree. Thomas Cole's son? Yes. I treated your father twice. Once for a winter fall. Once for pretending chest pain was indigestion. That sounds like him. It sounds like most men over 50 who think denial is a medical plan. This time Ethan did smile, but it came and went like a match struck in wind. Mara glanced toward the hall where Frank had been taken. You brought Mallory in? Ranger found him. I carried him out. At the sound of his name, Ranger shifted his weight, still staring down the corridor. Mara noticed. Her expression changed a little. Not soft exactly, but respectful. That dog knows who he came for. Ethan followed her gaze. He won't leave. Then don't make him, as long as he stays out of the nurse's way and doesn't eat anyone who deserves it. The nurse muttered, That's a broad category tonight. Mara heard and ignored it with professional grace. She led Ethan to a treatment bay across from Frank's room. The curtain remained half open. Ethan allowed the nurse to check his oxygen levels, listen to his lungs, shine a light in his eyes. He answered questions in short sentences. No, he had no chest pain. No, he had not lost consciousness. Yes, he understood smoke inhalation could worsen later. Yes, he would return if breathing became difficult. His mind stayed across the hall. Frank coughed behind the curtain of room 3. Ranger rose. The old German shepherd had been lying near Ethan's boot, but at the first rasp from Frank's lungs, he stood and looked toward the sound. His ears lifted. His torn left ear made the gesture look uneven and strangely noble. He does that every time, the nurse said quietly. Ethan said nothing. Frank coughed again, longer this time, a thin, painful sound. Ranger stepped to the doorway and stopped there, not crossing into the room until Ethan gave a small nod. The dog entered. Mara watched through the open curtain. Frank lay propped against white pillows, an oxygen cannula under his nose, a monitor clipped to his finger, his thin chest rising too fast beneath the hospital blanket. Soot darkened the lines around his mouth. His eyes were closed, but one hand moved restlessly over the blanket, searching for something that was not there. Ranger approached the bed and placed his muzzle beside that hand. Frank's fingers found fur. The hand stopped searching. The room seemed to quiet around that simple contact. Mara folded her arms. Interesting. What? His heart rate dropped. On the monitor, the numbers shifted downward by a few beats. Not a miracle. Not magic. Just a body learning, for one moment, that it was no longer alone. Ethan looked away before the sight could press too hard against something inside him. Mara clipped Frank's chart to the end of the bed and stepped back into the hallway. Her face had changed. The practical humor was gone now, replaced by the colder expression of a physician measuring facts she did not like. He is dehydrated, she said. Underfed. Not severely enough for the state to call it starvation, but enough that I will be writing it down. His skin turgor is poor. He has bruising at different stages on one hip and his upper arm. Could be falls. Could be transfers done badly. Could be both. Ethan's jaw tightened. Smoke inhalation? Moderate exposure. He was lucky you got him out when you did. Mara glanced at Ranger. Lucky he got loud. Ranger remained beside the bed, still and watchful. Mara continued, her voice lower. His nursing home paperwork describes him as non-compliant, socially withdrawn, poor appetite, verbally irritable. Sometimes those notes are true. Sometimes they are what facilities write when an old man still has enough pride to complain. Ethan looked through the glass panel at Frank. The old firefighter appeared smaller under hospital light than he had under smoke. Smoke had made him part of an emergency. Hospital light made him human. "How long has he been there?" Ethan asked. "St. Bartholomew? I'll need to check. I've seen him once before, maybe 8 months ago. Minor fall. He came in with that old coat and refused to let anyone cut it off, even though the sleeve was torn." "The firehouse coat?" Mara nodded. "You noticed?" "I noticed he cared about it. That coat may be the most consistent caregiver he has." The words landed hard because Mara did not say them cruelly. She said them like a fact that had grown tired of being hidden. A young nurse entered Frank's room, carrying a folded hospital gown and a basin. She was gentle, red-haired, freckled, and barely old enough to have learned how often gentleness was not enough. She looked through the doorway. "Dr. Winslow, we need to get this wet coat off him. It's smoky and cold. He keeps trying to hold it." Mara sighed. "Tell him we'll bag it and keep it with his belongings. He won't let go." Ethan did not know why he stepped forward. Maybe because Ranger looked back at him. Maybe because the old man had once, in a smoke-filled room, asked about Mrs. Agnes before asking for air. Maybe because there were certain objects a man held not because of what they were worth, but because without them he was afraid the world would forget who he had been. "I'll talk to him," Ethan said. Mara studied him for a moment, then nodded. Inside the room, Frank's eyes opened when Ethan approached. They were fogged with exhaustion and medication, but a stubborn blue flame still burned at the center. "Dog still here?" Frank whispered. "Yes." Smartest one in the room. The red-haired nurse smiled despite herself. Ethan stood beside the bed. "They need to take the coat off. It's wet and full of smoke." Frank's hand tightened around the dark navy fabric bunched near his chest. "No. They'll keep it safe." "People say that." The nurse lowered her eyes. She had no answer for that. Neither did Ethan, not at first. Then he reached down and unfastened his father's watch. Mara, standing in the doorway, noticed but did not speak. Ethan placed the old Hamilton watch on the rolling tray beside Frank's bed. "This was my father's," he said. "I don't leave it with strangers." Frank's eyes moved to the watch. "It stays there," Ethan said. "Your coat stays with it. I'll stand here until both are bagged and labeled. Nobody takes either out of this room unless you see it." Frank watched him through the oxygen tubing, breathing shallowly. "You a cop?" "No." "Preacher?" "No." Frank's mouth twitched. "Good. Bad luck twice would be excessive." Ethan felt the smallest crack of humor pass between them. Not warmth yet, not trust, but a plank laid over a narrow gap. "Retired Navy," Ethan said. Frank considered this. "That why you look like furniture that learned to walk?" The nurse coughed into her shoulder. Ethan nodded once. "Probably." Frank looked down at Ranger, whose head still rested close to his hand. "Dog says you're all right." "I've been cleared by worse judges." At last, Frank loosened his grip. The nurse moved carefully. Ethan helped lift the old man just enough for the coat to slide free. Frank winced but did not complain. Beneath the coat, his cardigan was damp, and his left shirt cuff had ridden up. Ethan saw the scar. It crossed the back of Frank's left hand in a pale crescent, curling toward the wrist like a moon someone had tried to erase. The skin around it was thin and shiny. Old burn tissue. Not a clean cut. Not an accident with kitchen glass. A burn. Ethan stared. His father's voice came from nowhere and everywhere. "Had a scar on his hand," Tommy had said once, after too much coffee and too little sleep, shaped kind of like a bent moon. Funny thing, what you remember when a man drags you out of hell. "Mr. Cole?" the nurse asked. Ethan looked up. The coat was free now. As the nurse folded it, a thread inside the lining caught on the rail of the bed. The old fabric pulled tight, then split with a soft tearing sound. Something small fell out and struck the floor. A silver sound. Not loud, but in that room, it rang like a bell from another year. Ranger lifted his head. Mara stepped closer. The nurse bent down, then paused before touching it, as if she understood without knowing why that the object belonged to more than hospital inventory. Ethan crouched and picked it up. It was a medal. Silver, tarnished almost black around the edges, round and heavy, attached to a short strip of faded red ribbon that had been folded and stitched into the lining. The front bore the seal of the Red Mill Fire Department, a helmet, crossed axes, a ladder. Around the rim, almost worn smooth, were the words, "For Valor." Ethan turned it over. There, scratched but readable, was a date. February 18th, 1987. His breath left him slowly. Mara saw his face. "Ethan?" But he was no longer fully in the hospital room. He was in his father's kitchen, 15 years old, watching Thomas Cole hold a coffee cup in both hands, because the winter made his fingers ache. He was hearing the story again, the one Thomas only told in pieces, always with a rough laugh to hide the part that frightened him. Mercer Street. February. Bad wiring. Child trapped upstairs. Smoke down to the floor. Thomas going back in when everyone told him not to. A firefighter finding him after the stairs half collapsed. The date had lived in Ethan's childhood like a family saint's day. February 18th, 1987. Ethan looked at Frank's left hand, the crescent scar, then at the medal, then at the old man breathing beneath the hospital blanket, eyes half closed, unaware that the thing he had hidden inside his coat had just opened a locked room in another man's past. Frank had not saved a stranger that night long ago. He had saved Thomas Cole. And because Thomas Cole had lived, Ethan had been raised by a father who taught him how to tie a fishing knot, how to take a punch without confusing pain with defeat, how to apologize badly but sincerely, how to stand at a grave and still believe duty meant something. Mara spoke softly. "Do you know what that is?" Ethan closed his hand around the medal. "I might." But might was not enough. Not for a truth this large. Not for a man lying in a hospital bed with no family in the room and smoke still clinging to his hair. Ethan stood. "Can I see his belongings bag?" The nurse handed him a clear plastic bag containing the coat, Frank's old cardigan, a key, and a folded paper activity card from the nursing home. Nothing else. No wallet, no family photos, no phone. No one had arrived asking for him. Ethan placed the medal carefully on the tray beside his father's watch. The two objects looked strange together, one that had measured time, one that had bought it. He turned to Mara. "I need an hour." "For what?" "To check something." Mara looked toward Frank. "He may wake up asking for the coat." "Tell him the man who left his father's watch beside it will bring it back." She held his gaze, then nodded. "Drive carefully." Ethan looked at Ranger. The dog had not moved from the bed. "You coming?" Ranger did not move. Frank coughed weakly, and Ranger shifted closer, laying his muzzle near the old man's elbow. Ethan understood the answer. For the first time since Ranger had come into his life, The dog was choosing to stay with someone else. It should have bothered him. Instead, it felt right in a way he did not yet want to name. "Stay," Ethan said quietly. Ranger blinked once. Ethan put the watch back on his wrist, then paused. He removed it again and left it beside the metal. A promise required collateral. The old house on Sycamore Road waited exactly where his memory had left it, and somehow worse. Ethan unlocked the front door under the sagging porch roof and stepped into darkness that smelled of cedar, dust, and winter coats. He did not turn on every light. Only the hallway lamp, then the kitchen lamp. Too much brightness would have made the emptiness rude. His father's boots were no longer by the door. His coffee mug was not in the sink. The chair at the kitchen table stood pushed in too neatly, the way houses arrange themselves after the dead have stopped interrupting. Ethan went to the hall closet. On the top shelf was the metal box Thomas had kept important papers in: discharge forms, insurance documents, fishing licenses, newspaper clippings, receipts he insisted might matter someday. Ethan had seen it after the funeral, but had not opened it fully. He had told himself there would be time. Men were fools about time. The box came down with a cough of dust. Inside, beneath a bundle of property tax papers, Ethan found a yellowed envelope with his father's handwriting across the front. Mercer Fire. His fingers stopped. For a moment, he could not open it. The house seemed to lean close. Rain whispered in the gutters. Somewhere in the walls, old pipes ticked as the heat stirred awake. Ethan touched the watch that was not on his wrist and felt the absence like a missing pulse. Then he opened the envelope. A newspaper clipping slid out first. The headline was faded, but still readable. Local officer and child rescued from Mercer Street blaze. The photograph beneath showed a younger Thomas Cole wrapped in a blanket outside a burned house. Soot streaked across his face. Beside him stood a firefighter in a dark coat, helmet tucked under one arm, his left hand bandaged thickly. The man's face was turned partly away, blurred by motion and newsprint. The caption named him: Firefighter Frank Mallory. Ethan sat down at the kitchen table before his knees could make the choice for him. There was another paper in the envelope, a letter, never mailed. Dear Frank, I have tried to write this 3 times and thrown it away twice because thank you is too small for what I owe you. Ethan read slowly, each line striking a place inside him he had kept armored for years. His father wrote about waking in the hospital and asking if the child had lived, about learning that Frank had gone back through the smoke after both of them, about the hand injury, about guilt, about gratitude, about the strange burden of being given more years than a man expected. Near the end, Thomas had written, I owe you more than my life. I owe you the years I got to watch my son grow. I owe you the fishing trips, the arguments, the scraped knees, the mornings I still get to hear him come down the stairs. If I never find the courage to say this right, let this paper know I tried. Ethan lowered the letter. The kitchen blurred. Not with tears at first, with distance, as if the room had moved away from him and left him sitting at the center of a truth too large to touch. Thomas had tried to say, thank you. Ethan had not tried hard enough to say goodbye. That was the cruel exchange the night offered him. He sat there for several minutes, maybe more, with the rain tapping softly against the window and the old house holding its breath around him. Then he folded the letter with the care one used for flags. Back at the hospital, the emergency department had quieted into that strange hour when exhaustion makes everyone whisper. Mara was at the nurse's station writing notes. She looked up when Ethan entered. She did not ask if he had found what he needed. His face must have answered. Ranger was still in Frank's room. Frank slept, though not peacefully. His breathing rasped, then steadied, then rasped again. Ranger lay on the floor beside the bed, head lifted just enough to keep watch. The medal remained on the tray where Ethan had left it. Beside it sat his father's watch, patient and accusing. Ethan placed the newspaper clipping and the unsent letter on the tray. Mara came to the doorway but did not enter. Ethan stood beside Frank's bed. There were words a man imagined saying in such moments. Grand words, clean words, words shaped like closure. None came. What could he say? Thank you for giving me my father. Sorry, no one came for you. Sorry, I did not know your name while you were being forgotten 30 minutes from where my father was buried. Frank stirred. His eyes opened halfway. You back? He whispered. Yes. Dog behave? Better than me. Frank's mouth twitched, then faded. Ethan pulled the chair closer to the bed and sat down. It was an ordinary hospital chair. Vinyl seat, metal legs, slight wobble in the left front corner. Still, when Ethan sat, the room changed. Not for Mara, not for the nurses, for Frank, for Ranger, for Ethan himself. A chair beside a sickbed was not a dramatic thing. It did not kick down doors or carry men through smoke. It did not earn medals or make headlines. But it was where duty went after the sirens stopped. Frank's hand moved faintly over the blanket. Ranger rose and placed his muzzle beneath it. Ethan reached for the letter but did not open it again. Not yet. He simply sat there, in the chair no one from Frank's family had filled, while the old firefighter breathed. The dog kept watch, and 2 pieces of silver on a hospital tray held between them the weight of borrowed years. Morning came to Red Mill without warmth. The rain had stopped, but the town still looked rinsed and tired, as if the night had scrubbed something raw out of it. Water clung to the hospital windows in uneven trails. Beyond the glass, the parking lot shone under a pale sky, every puddle holding a piece of gray cloud. Frank Mallory slept through most of the morning. Not peacefully, but deeply enough that the nurses lowered their voices when they passed his room. Oxygen hissed softly beside the bed. A monitor counted out his stubborn heart. His old firehouse coat had been sealed in a clear belongings bag and placed on the chair nearest the wall, where Frank could see it if he woke. The medal was no longer inside the lining. It lay in a small tray beside the bed, next to the newspaper clipping and Thomas Cole's unsent letter. Ethan had not told Frank yet. The old man's body had earned a few hours before history asked anything more of him. Ranger lay on the floor near the bed, but he was not sleeping. He had the stillness of a guard dog carved from weathered wood, only his eyes moving when nurses entered or Frank shifted under the blanket. Ethan stood at the window with a paper cup of hospital coffee cooling in his hand. He had been awake all night. His lungs ached. His clothes smelled faintly of smoke, despite the clean shirt Mara had found for him in a staff donation box. He had called the real estate agent at 6:30 in the morning and left a simple message. Delay the listing. No explanation. Some decisions did not need witnesses. Behind him, Dr. Mara Winslow stepped into the room with a tablet tucked under one arm. She had changed into a fresh white coat, but the night still sat beneath her eyes. She looked at Frank first, then at Ranger, then at Ethan. You should go sleep, she said. You said that 2 hours ago. I've been right for 2 hours. Any change? Stable, tired. Irritated even in his sleep, which I consider a promising sign. Ethan glanced toward Frank. Family? Mara's expression tightened. That is where things get less promising. She tapped the tablet awake. St. Bartholomew sent over his transfer summary and emergency contacts. The summary is polished. Too polished. Frank is described as difficult, non-compliant, resistant to meals, socially withdrawn, prone to agitation. Is any of that true? Maybe some. Old men who have lost autonomy tend to object when treated like furniture. Facilities often call that agitation. Ethan looked back at the bed. Emergency contacts? Son, Alan Mallory. Daughter-in-law, Denise Mallory. Granddaughter, Claire Mallory. Alan is first contact. Denise second. Claire third. Did anyone answer? Alan's voicemail. Denise's voicemail. Claire answered. Ethan turned. Mara handed him a folded sticky note with a number written on it. She is on her way from Lancaster County. She sounded like someone who had just learned the floor under her childhood was made of paper. Ethan took the note but did not call yet. Before he could speak, a man appeared in the doorway. He did not knock. He was in his late 40s, lean, clean-shaven, and dressed in a navy suit that looked too expensive for the tired hospital hallway. His blonde-gray hair was combed back carefully. A silver name badge shone on his lapel, Glenn Rusk, Administrator. In one hand, he carried a black leather tablet case. In the other, a paper coffee cup from a better place than this hospital. He smiled at Mara first, then at Ethan, then at the bed. The smile did not reach anything important. "Dr. Winslow," he said, "I came as soon as I could." Mara looked at the clock on the wall. "It is 9:20. "Yes, a terrible night. We are all very shaken." Ethan watched him. Glenn Rusk stepped farther into the room, careful not to come too close to Ranger. Ranger lifted his head without rising. That was enough to make the administrator adjust his path. "And you are?" Glenn asked Ethan. "Ethan Cole." "Family?" "No." "Then I'm afraid certain details regarding Mr. Mallory's care are private." Mara's eyes went flat. Mr. Cole pulled him out of a smoke-filled room. "And everyone at St. Bartholomew is grateful for his assistance," Glenn said smoothly. "But gratitude does not override patient privacy." Ethan said nothing. He had met men like Glenn Rusk in other uniforms, under other flags. Men who believed a calm voice could make rot sound like policy. Men who did not lie with heat when ice would do. Mara crossed her arms. "Your staff summary says Frank was checked at 10 p.m. That is my understanding. He was found near the door of room 216 after using a cane to strike a pipe for help." Glenn looked down at his tablet. A small delay, less than a second, but Ethan saw it. "Again," Glenn said, "Mr. Mallory has a documented history of irregular sleep patterns and agitation. He often moves around his room at night. It is possible he became disoriented during the alarm event." "Alarm event," Ethan repeated. Glenn turned to him. "A small electrical issue in a utility area, localized, contained quickly." Mara's voice sharpened. An 81-year-old man was trapped behind a stuck door with smoke in his room. "And we will review the circumstances internally." "Who was assigned to the East Hall?" "That is part of the review." "How many staff were on shift?" "Doctor, staffing matrices vary based on census acuity." "How many?" Glenn's smile thinned. Ethan set his coffee on the windowsill. The paper cup made a soft sound, but Glenn glanced at it as if it had interrupted him. "I understand emotions are high," Glenn said. "But St. Bartholomew has served this community for decades. Mr. Mallory's case is complicated. He refuses assistance. He declines meals. He resists hygiene care. He isolates himself from group activities." From the bed came a dry whisper. "Group activities are hell." Everyone turned. Frank's eyes had opened to narrow slits. His face was still gray with exhaustion, but his timing had not suffered in the fire. Mara went to him immediately. "Don't talk too much." Frank ignored this medical advice with the dignity of a man long practiced in ignoring sensible women. "Last activity," he rasped. "They made us glue cotton balls to paper sheep." The nurse outside the room made a choking sound that might have been a laugh. Glenn recovered first. "Mr. Mallory, I am glad to see you alert. We were very concerned." Frank's gaze wandered until it found Ranger. "Dog concerned," he whispered. "You dressed." Ethan lowered his head, hiding the briefest smile. Glenn's face remained pleasant, but something tightened near his jaw. Mara checked Frank's oxygen and adjusted the blanket. "Enough. Save your breath." Frank's eyelids lowered again, but not before his fingers twitched toward Ranger. The dog rose, came close, and rested his chin on the edge of the mattress. Frank's hand touched the torn ear. The room fell into a silence no administrator could organize. Then a timid knock came from the doorway. Lily Parker stood there. She looked younger in daylight, and worse for it. Her pale blue scrubs were wrinkled. Her hair was tied back, but stray strands framed a face made hollow by no sleep and too much fear. In her hands, she held a small yellow notebook pressed so tightly to her chest that her knuckles had whitened. Glenn turned. "Lily," he said. One word. Not loud, not angry. It struck her harder than shouting would have. She swallowed. "I came to check on Mr. Mallory." "That is thoughtful, but unnecessary. You should go home and rest. We will debrief later." The word debrief sounded like a door closing. Lily's eyes moved to Ethan, then Mara. "I also brought something," she said. Glenn's smile did not change. Any facility documentation should remain within facility channels. "This isn't facility documentation." She stepped into the room. Her hands trembled, but she came anyway. Ethan felt the air shift, not dramatically, not like the discovery of the metal. This was smaller, more dangerous in its own way. A young woman choosing to stop being managed by fear. Lily opened the yellow notebook. "I write things down," she said, mostly to Mara. "For residents, not official things, just things I'm afraid I'll forget, because there are too many of them and not enough of us. Mrs. Agnes needs her hearing aids put in after dinner, because she takes them out when her ears hurt. Mr. Mallory's door sticks if the room gets damp. The East Hall call buttons go dead when the panel by the laundry room trips." Glenn's voice cooled. "Lily," she flinched, but did not stop. "I sent maintenance requests, 3 for his door, 2 for the call buttons. I texted night supervisor about staffing last week. I have screenshots." She turned a page and pulled out folded papers, phone screenshots printed at the library, unevenly cut, stapled by hand. Ethan looked at them. Dates, times, short messages, room 216, door still sticking badly. Concerned and emergency. East Hall call lights down again after 11:40 p.m. Only 2 aides tonight for second floor plus memory wing. Unsafe. The replies, when there were replies, were brief. Noted. Budget review pending. Manage with available resources. Glenn's expression finally changed. Not much. Enough. "Lily," he said softly, "you are tired and upset. This is not the appropriate—" "An old man almost died," Lily said. Her voice cracked, but the words held. Frank opened his eyes again. For a moment, Lily could not look at him. Shame pulled her gaze to the floor. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I should have checked again. I knew the door was bad." Frank breathed through the oxygen tube. His voice was barely there. "You got Agnes out?" Lily nodded, tears spilling now. "Yes." Frank closed his eyes. "Then don't hog all the blame. There's plenty of it walking around." The sentence was weak, almost lost under the hiss of oxygen, but Lily heard it. So did Glenn. Mara took the printed screenshots from Lily with careful hands. "I'll make copies for the chart." Glenn stepped forward. "Doctor, I must object to unofficial documents being placed." "No," Mara said. The word was clean and final. Glenn paused. Mara looked at him as if he were a symptom. "You can object in writing. Use a nice letterhead." Ethan almost felt sorry for the letterhead. Almost. A nurse came to the doorway. "Dr. Winslow, Claire Mallory is at the desk." Frank's fingers tightened slightly in Ranger's fur. It was the first sign that the name had reached him. Mara glanced at Ethan, then at Frank. "Are you up for seeing your granddaughter?" Frank turned his face toward the window. "No." It was not anger. It was something harder to witness. Shame. Lily wiped her cheeks and backed toward the wall. Glenn stood very still, recalculating the room and his place in it. Ethan did not speak. He had learned that some doors could not be kicked open without damaging the person behind them. Mara went to the nurse's station. A minute later, Claire Mallory stepped into the hallway outside Frank's room and stopped as if the floor had tilted. She was 29, maybe 30, small-framed in a teal cardigan and tan slacks, with chestnut hair hastily tied low at the back of her neck. A teacher's lanyard still hung from her bag, decorated with tiny wooden apples and one little charm shaped like a matchstick. Her eyes were red from the drive, but clear. Not weak, just newly wounded. She looked first at Glenn Rusk. "Mr. Rusk," she said, "you told my father he was stable." "He is stable," Glenn replied. "Your grandfather experienced a minor smoke exposure incident during an electrical event, but as you can see..." Claire looked past him into the room. At the oxygen, at the monitor, at the yellow-gray color of Frank's face, at Ranger beside the bed. Something in her expression broke, but she held the pieces with both hands. "Minor?" she asked. Glenn did not answer quickly. That, more than any accusation, gave her the truth. Claire stepped into the room slowly. Ranger lifted his head. Ethan prepared to call him back, but the dog only watched her with steady amber eyes. Frank kept his face turned away. "Grandpa?" Claire said. The word changed the room more than the fire alarm had. Frank's closed eyelids tightened. Claire came closer, but not too close. She knew enough, or loved enough, not to rush a proud man lying helpless under a hospital blanket. "It's Claire." Frank's mouth moved. No sound came. Claire looked at Ethan, confused and afraid. Ethan shook his head once, a small message. "Give him time." Her gaze fell to the tray beside the bed. The metal, the letter, the clipping, then to the clear plastic bag holding Frank's coat. "He still has that coat," she whispered. Frank's eyes opened. He did not look at her. "Should have burned it," he rasped. Claire let out a small sound, almost a laugh, almost a sob. "You said that every winter and then threatened anyone who touched it." No response. She reached into her bag with trembling fingers and pulled out a keychain. A tiny wooden matchstick dangled from it, painted red at the tip, worn smooth along the edges. "I still have it," she said. Frank's eyes moved at last. Not to her face, to the keychain. The old man's breathing changed. Claire held it up, her smile breaking under tears. You made it after I set Grandma's table runner on fire. You told Mom I was either going to be a criminal or a firefighter." Frank stared at the little matchstick. His voice, when it came, was no stronger than smoke under a door. "Little matchstick!" Claire covered her mouth. The tears came then, fully and without elegance. She bent forward, but did not touch him until Frank's hand moved from Ranger's head, just barely, toward her. That was enough. Claire took his hand. Not the burned one. The other. "I thought you didn't want us to come," she said. "Dad said you got upset. He said visits confused you. He said you were better with routine." Frank's face tightened with a pain that had nothing to do with smoke. Ranger lowered his head again, not onto Frank this time, but between Frank's hand and Claire's, as if anchoring the contact. "No one asked me," Frank whispered. Claire closed her eyes. Ethan looked away. There were moments too private for strangers, even when strangers had carried a man out of smoke. But Frank's family had left a chair empty so long that even privacy needed witnesses. Glenn Rusk cleared his throat quietly. "Claire, this is an emotional time. I would caution against drawing conclusions based on—" Claire turned on him. She did not shout. That made it stronger. "I want every record." Glenn's expression smoothed instantly. "Your father is the primary contact and responsible party. I am listed as emergency contact. Third. Then call it third place, finally showing up." Lily looked down, but Ethan saw the corner of her mouth tremble. Claire stood straighter. Her cardigan sleeves had slipped over her hands, making her look younger than she sounded. "I want care notes, incident reports, meal logs, maintenance requests related to his room, staffing records for last night. And I want to know why I was told my grandfather was refusing visits." Glenn's tablet case creaked softly under his grip. These requests must go through proper channels. "Good," Claire said. "Show me the channel." For the first time since entering the hospital, Glenn Rusk had no polished sentence ready. Ethan saw Alan Mallory in that silence before he met the man. A son somewhere letting others speak for him. A father who had allowed distance to dress itself as practicality. A family name being carried like a box no one wanted to open. Claire turned back to Frank and lowered herself into the chair beside his bed. The chair Ethan had sat in. The chair that had been empty too long. She did not ask permission from anyone. She placed the little wooden matchstick on the tray beside the metal, not as evidence, as memory. Frank's fingers rested loosely in hers. Outside the room, the hospital continued its ordinary work, phones ringing, shoes moving, carts rattling over tile. But inside, something old and wounded had shifted, not healed, not forgiven. Only shifted enough for daylight to get in. Ethan stepped toward the doorway. Claire looked up. "Mr. Cole." "Ethan, Dr. Winslow said you saved him." Ethan glanced at Ranger. "We found him." Claire's eyes moved to the dog, then back to her grandfather. "Thank you." Ethan did not answer immediately. The easy answer would have been "You're welcome." The true answer was more complicated and belonged to a medal, a letter, and a dead father's borrowed years, so he only nodded. Claire tightened her hand around Frank's. "I'm not leaving," she said. Frank's eyes remained closed, but his grip changed, faint and unmistakable. He had heard. At the foot of the bed, Ranger settled down with a long, tired breath. Glenn Rusk stood in the hallway, still holding his tablet, still wearing his polished suit, but the room no longer belonged to his language of procedures and incidents. It belonged to an old firefighter, a granddaughter with a wooden matchstick, a young aide with shaking hands and printed screenshots, a doctor who knew neglect when it wore a clean tie, and a retired Navy SEAL who had come to sell his father's house, only to find another family's locked door waiting for him. Claire looked once more at Glenn. "Start with the records," she said. This time her voice did not shake. Paper had a strange mercy. People could soften a sentence. They could smile while hiding a knife. They could call neglect a misunderstanding, loneliness a preference, hunger a refusal. But paper, if gathered patiently enough, began to betray the hand that wrote it. By noon, Red Mill Community Hospital had given Claire Mallory a small consultation room near the nurses' station. It was meant for families receiving difficult news. The chairs were too soft, the tissues too visible, the table too polished by grief. Now it held a different kind of sorrow. Printouts, photocopies, Lily Parker's yellow notebook, Dr. Mara Winslow's medical notes, and a stack of forms from St. Bartholomew Nursing Home that looked tidy enough to be trusted. That was what bothered Ethan most. The forms were neat. Neglect should have looked uglier. It should have come stained, misspelled, shaking in the hand. Instead, it arrived in clean columns with checkboxes and professional language. Patient declined meal. Resident refused group participation. Minor transfer bruise observed. Call light malfunction reported to maintenance. Will review during next budget cycle. Claire sat at the table with her cardigan sleeves pushed up, a pen in one hand and Frank's emergency contact sheet in the other. The little wooden matchstick keychain lay beside her notebook like a small red-tipped witness. She had stopped crying. That worried Ethan more than the tears had. Tears moved. This stillness built walls. Mara stood at the head of the table reading through a meal log. She had the posture of a doctor in a room full of symptoms, except this time the patient was a system and the infection had learned legal vocabulary. Lily sat nearest the door, as though some part of her still expected Glenn Rusk to appear and order her back into silence. Her yellow notebook was open before her. In daylight, the pages looked almost childish. Small handwriting, underlined names, stars beside urgent reminders. Mrs. Vale, afraid of dark hallway after 10. Mr. Leonard, left hip sore after fall, ask nurse. Agnes, hearing aids after supper, check batteries. Frank M., door sticks when damp, likes coffee black, hates paper sheep. Ethan read that last line twice. Hates paper sheep. A whole human life had been reduced in the official record to non-compliant. But in Lily's cramped handwriting, Frank still disliked bad coffee and children's crafts. Somehow that felt more honest than every document wearing a letterhead. Captain Caleb Dorsey arrived from the firehouse at noon. He had changed out of turnout gear, but still carried the smell of smoke and rain with him, the ghostly cologne of his profession. He wore a Navy Red Mill Fire Department sweatshirt, work pants, and the expression of a young man trying to honor old heroes without turning them into statues. Under one arm, he carried a flat cardboard archive box. "My father kept these at the station," Caleb said, setting the box on the table. Old incident summaries, newspaper clippings, some photos. Frank shows up in half of them, even when nobody meant to photograph him. Claire looked up. "You knew him?" "Not really," Caleb said. "I knew the stories first. At the firehouse, stories are how men stay in the room after they leave it." No one answered for a moment. Then Mara said, "That may be the most firefighter thing anyone has ever said." Caleb gave a tired half-smile. "We have a limited range." Ethan opened the box carefully. Inside were folders labeled by year. Some edges had gone soft with age. Caleb pulled one free and unfolded a photocopied incident report from 1987, then a newer folder from the last annual safety walkthrough at St. Bartholomew. "This is where it gets ugly," Caleb said. Claire's pen stopped moving. Caleb laid the paper flat. 16 months ago, our department recommended updates to the alarm relay in the East Wing. Not a full failure. Intermittent faults. Enough to fix before it became a problem. "Was it fixed?" Ethan asked. Caleb's jaw tightened. "I can't find a completion record. There's a note that says facility deferred non-critical upgrade pending capital review." "Non-critical," Mara repeated. Her voice made the word sound like something found under a rock. Lily wiped her palms on her scrubs. "The East Hall lights blink sometimes. The call buttons too. We tell them. Maintenance resets the panel and says it's working." "Who signs off?" Claire asked. Lily looked down. "Mr. Rusk?" Lily nodded. One piece, then another. The pattern did not arrive like thunder. It assembled itself with the patient cruelty of frost. A door repair request marked low priority. A note about Frank refusing meals on days when Lily had written that he slept through dinner because no one woke him. A fall report for Mr. Leonard describing self-initiated floor sitting. A phrase so absurd Ethan had to stare at it before he understood it meant an old man had fallen and someone had made the floor sound like his destination. Mrs. Agnes had 3 notes requesting hearing aid battery checks. The official record said she was non-responsive to auditory safety cues. Mara set the paper down slowly. She did not fail to respond to safety cues, the doctor said. They failed to make safety audible. Claire closed her eyes. For the first time that day, anger entered her face not as flame, but as inheritance. Something of Frank was there. Not his age, not his scars, his refusal to let the wrong word stand. "These records make it sound like they were problems," she said. "They were residents," Mara said. Lily's voice came small from the end of the table. "Sometimes if someone complained a lot, they'd move them to the end rooms. Quieter there, less traffic." Ethan looked at her. "Frank complained?" Lily gave a broken little laugh. "About everything that mattered. The door, the panel, Agnes not hearing, Mr. Leonard needing grab bars, the radiator smell. He said the building was talking and nobody was listening." Caleb bowed his head. "A firefighter would say that." Lily twisted a tissue in her hands. "Mr. Rusk called him disruptive." Claire whispered. "Grandpa called it a warning." The room went quiet. There in that stillness, the whole shape of the cruelty appeared. Frank had not been ignored because he was silent. He had been pushed aside because he was not. Ranger had been lying outside the consultation room, allowed in the hospital only by the combined force of Mara's authority and the fact that everyone who might object had decided not to argue with a German shepherd who looked like retired thunder. At Claire's whisper, he lifted his head and looked toward the door. Ethan followed the dog's gaze. Across the hall, Frank's room stood partly open. The old man was asleep again, face turned toward the window, one hand curled weakly over the blanket. His coat hung in the clear bag by the wall. Without it, he looked less like a legend and more like what he was, an old man who had survived too much to be dismissed politely. Ethan felt anger press against his ribs. Not the useful kind yet. The other kind. The kind that wanted a face to blame because systems did not bruise when struck. He thought of Frank Mallory then, though he had not yet met him. The son who had signed papers. The son who had let messages go to voicemail. The son who had perhaps told himself the same story too many families told. Professionals know best. Dad is difficult. I am doing what I can. Ethan wanted to despise him, but the desire snagged on memory. Thomas Cole sitting alone at his kitchen table. Thomas answering the phone with too much cheer because he did not want his son to hear disappointment. Thomas saying, "Don't worry about me, son. Finish what you started." And Ethan, grateful for the excuse, had finished one thing after another. Deployments, contracts, recovery, silence. He had not put his father in a nursing home. He had not ignored broken call lights or left him behind a stuck door. But absence had many uniforms. Some wore paperwork. Some wore duty. Some wore the noble face of being too busy doing important things far away. Ethan stood abruptly. The chair scraped the floor. Claire looked up. "Are you all right?" "No." It was the first fully honest answer he had given all day. He walked out before anyone could ask more and crossed to Frank's room. Ranger rose and followed. The old firefighter woke when Ethan entered, not fully, but enough. His eyes opened to narrow blue slits. "You walk heavy," Frank rasped. Ethan stopped at the foot of the bed. "Sorry." "Didn't say stop," said heavy. Ranger went to the side of the bed and sat. This time he did not place his muzzle on Frank's hand. He simply waited, as if he knew some conversations required space even from love. Ethan glanced back toward the consultation room. Through the glass, he could see Claire leaning over records, Mara pointing to a form, Caleb speaking quietly, Lily listening with her shoulders hunched. "They're finding things," Ethan said. "Bad things?" "Yes." Frank closed his eyes. Place always had bad bones. "You told them?" "Everybody." "And?" "Old men complain, young men manage, middlemen budget." The sentence would have been funny if it had not sounded so practiced. Ethan moved closer. "Why didn't you tell your family?" Frank's jaw tightened. There it was. A door even smoke had not opened easily. "Didn't want Claire seeing me like that." "And your son?" For a while, Frank said nothing. A monitor beeped. Wheels rattled somewhere down the hallway. A child cried briefly in another room, then quieted. Frank looked toward the window. "Alan grew up in the firehouse," he said. "I hated every minute of it by the end." Ethan waited. People meant well. They'd clap him on the shoulder and say, "You going to be like your old man." Every damn week, like a boy is a ladder you can lean expectations on. Frank breathed shallowly, gathering strength. He wasn't built for sirens. He liked numbers, order, quiet. I didn't understand that soon enough. Ethan did not expect the tenderness. It slipped under his anger like a hand under a door. "Doesn't excuse him," Frank said, eyes still on the window. "No. But makes him human. Worst thing about family is they're human right when you need them to be heroes." Ethan's throat tightened. He looked at the tray beside the bed, the medal, the newspaper clipping, the unsent letter. Mara had left them there, as if the room itself needed to remember. "Frank," Ethan said, "my father was Thomas Cole." The old man's eyes moved to him. No recognition at first. Then a small flicker. "Cop," Frank whispered. "Yes." "Stubborn idiot." Ethan let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "That's the one." Frank stared at him longer now, looking past the beard, the gray at the temples, the field jacket, seeing perhaps a boy who had once stood beside a hospital bed, or perhaps just the echo of a man he had dragged from smoke. "He lived?" Frank asked. The question surprised Ethan so much that he answered too quickly. "Yes." Frank's eyes sharpened with old worry. The child? Yes, both. The old firefighter closed his eyes. For more than 30 years, Ethan realized, Frank may have carried the question in a pocket of his mind no one ever opened. Not whether he had been thanked, not whether he had been praised, whether they had lived. They told you, Ethan said carefully. Didn't they? Somebody said. Frank swallowed. Smoke makes memory a liar. Good to hear again. Ethan picked up his father's letter but did not unfold it. He wrote to you, never sent it. Frank looked at the paper without reaching for it. Your father was good at hard things, Frank said. Bad at soft ones. Yes. So are you. The words landed without cruelty, because they were true. Ethan sat in the chair beside the bed. Frank's breathing remained rough, but his mind, for the moment, was clear enough to travel backward. He went back in, Frank said. Your father. Everybody yelled at him not to. He heard there was a kid upstairs, and that was it. Some men hear a cry and become deaf to everything else. Ethan unfolded the letter slowly. Frank continued, eyes half closed. Stairs were burning under us. Couldn't see my own glove. Found him by the sound of him cursing, not praying. Cursing. Told me if I didn't get the kid first, he'd arrest me. Despite himself, Ethan laughed. Frank smiled faintly. I told him if he survived, I'd let him. The laugh faded. What happened then? Ethan asked. Same thing that always happens. Somebody pulls somebody, somebody else pulls them. You don't save alone. People like to pretend heroes stand by themselves because it makes for a cleaner statue. Frank opened his eyes. But we were never statues. We were a chain. Ethan looked down at the letter. His father's handwriting shook slightly in the final lines, though Thomas had been younger then than Ethan was now. Frank spoke again, softer. We passed the torch, son. That's all. I pulled your father out. Maybe he pulled others. Maybe he pulled you through things you didn't know had teeth. Ethan could not answer. Frank did not need him to. Holding a torch doesn't make you special, the old man said. Just means you're responsible for where you point the light. The words entered Ethan quietly. No trumpet, no thunder. Just an old man in a hospital bed, handing him a fire that did not burn. In the consultation room, Claire signed the first request form under Mara's guidance. Caleb prepared copies of the fire department inspection notes. Lily, pale but steadier now, wrote her statement in careful lines, stopping only once to wipe her eyes with the back of her hand. The work had begun. Not revenge. Work. That mattered. By late afternoon, the hospital fax machine near the nurses' station began sending documents to the County Adult Protective Services Office and the State Long-Term Care Ombudsman. Mara attached her medical findings. Caleb added the fire department's prior safety recommendations. Claire signed a formal request for care records as Frank's listed emergency contact, with a note that further consent would be obtained when he was medically able to provide it. Lily agreed to speak to investigators and provided copies of her maintenance texts. Nothing exploded. No one was arrested in the hallway. Glen Rusk did not collapse under a dramatic confession. The machinery of truth moved more slowly than anger wanted, but it moved. Ethan stood outside Frank's room as evening settled over the hospital. The sky beyond the windows had turned the color of cooled ash. Ranger stood beside him, shoulder against his leg, both of them looking through the glass. Frank slept. Claire sat in the chair now, her head bowed, one hand still holding her grandfather's. She had not left, not for food, not for rest. Mara had finally brought her a sandwich and ordered her to eat half of it. Caleb had returned to the station. Lily had gone home under Mara's instruction, and Ethan's quiet promise that if Glenn tried to punish her tonight, he would not be the only one hearing about it tomorrow. On the tray beside Frank's bed lay 4 objects in a row: the medal, the newspaper clipping, Thomas Cole's unsent letter, the little wooden matchstick. They did not accuse loudly. They did not need to. Ethan watched them and understood, with the slow certainty of a man seeing his next mission take shape, that this fight would not be won by force. No door needed kicking down now. No enemy would present himself with a weapon in hand. This was a different battlefield. Forms, phone calls, signatures, testimony, patience. The enemy was neglect dressed in policy, fear dressed in fatigue, and love postponed until it became indistinguishable from abandonment. Ranger leaned his weight more firmly against Ethan's leg. Ethan looked down at him. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I know." The old command on Ranger's collar caught the hallway light. "Find one more." Ethan had thought it meant one more body under rubble, one more hand in smoke, one more person pulled breathing into the open air. Now he understood it could also mean one more truth, one more witness, one more door opened before someone disappeared behind it. Inside the room, Frank slept beneath the pale blanket, no longer alone. Outside the room, Ethan remained standing, not as a soldier waiting for orders, as a man finally willing to receive them from the living. The Red Mill firehouse smelled like coffee that had been reheated too many times, and work boots that had survived worse nights than their owners. It was an old brick building with 3 red bay doors facing Main Street, each door scarred by decades of winter salt and hurried departures. Inside, the engines slept in polished silence, their chrome catching the overhead lights. Coiled hoses lined one wall, helmets hung from hooks. A long wooden table stood in the common room, its surface marked by coffee rings, pocket knife scratches, and the elbows of men who had waited there for alarms that changed other people's lives. On the walls were photographs, not the kind found in museums, framed to flatter memory. These were station photographs, crooked, faded, pinned beside plaques and newspaper clippings. Men in soot-blackened coats grinning around a rescued dog. A crew standing knee-deep in snow after a barn fire. A young firefighter holding a child wrapped in a blanket, his own face so dark with smoke that only his eyes and teeth showed. Frank Mallory appeared in many of them, sometimes in the center, more often at the edge. That suited him, Ethan thought. The meeting had not been Ethan's idea alone. That mattered. Mara had insisted a hospital room was the wrong place. Caleb had offered the firehouse because Frank had been strongest there once. Claire had said her father would never face the truth if it arrived as a stack of documents. The county investigator had agreed to attend informally, not as a judge, but as a witness to the concerns being raised. So the firehouse became the room. Not a courtroom, not a church. Something between the two. Ethan arrived early with Ranger. He placed Frank's old Navy firehouse coat over the back of a chair at the head of the long table. The coat had been cleaned enough to remove the smoke, but not enough to erase its age. The Red Mill Fire Department patch on the sleeve was faded, the stitching frayed at one corner. On the table in front of the chair, Ethan set the silver medal. For valor. Beside it, Claire placed the little wooden matchstick keychain. No one had planned that arrangement. It happened quietly, as if the objects knew where they belonged. Ranger sniffed the coat once, then sat beside the chair. He did not look like a guard dog now. He looked like an honor guard. Caleb watched from near the coffee machine, arms folded over his Navy Fire Department sweatshirt. He had said very little that morning. The sight of Frank's coat at the head of the table had changed him from captain into grandson of the station. His father had been trained by Frank. That made this more than a report. It made it family of another kind. Mara came next, carrying a thin folder instead of the thick stack from the hospital. "Only what matters," she said when Ethan glanced at it. "Too much paper lets people hide in the pile." Lily Parker arrived in plain clothes, not scrubs, a gray sweater, jeans, and sneakers. Without her badge, she looked younger, almost like someone's tired niece after a long exam week. She held her yellow notebook in both hands, but did not open it. Not yet. Then Claire entered with Alan and Denise Mallory. Alan paused just inside the common room. He was 53, broad enough to suggest he had once been strong but soft now at the middle, with thinning brown-gray hair and a face that seemed permanently braced for criticism. His jacket was charcoal, office-worn, a little tight in the shoulders. His eyes were Frank's color, but they avoided the photographs on the wall as if those old images might recognize him and ask why he had not visited. Denise stood beside him in a camel-colored coat, purse held neatly against her ribs. She had sharp cheekbones, careful makeup, and the controlled look of a woman who had spent years converting fear into schedules. Her eyes moved quickly. Coat, medal, faces, exits. She was not heartless. Ethan saw that almost immediately, but she had taught herself not to feel things until they became practical. That was its own danger. Claire walked behind them, quieter than she had been at the hospital. She was not there to attack. She was there to keep from disappearing back into the family story she had been handed. Alan saw the coat. His breath changed. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just a slight break in the rhythm, the body telling the truth before the mouth remembered its defenses. "What is this?" he asked. "A meeting," Claire said. "We could have done this at the hospital." "No," she replied. "At the hospital, Grandpa is a patient. Here he is Frank Mallory." Denise looked toward Mara. "Is he well enough to be moved?" "He insisted," Mara said. "Medically, I would have preferred more rest. Personally, I have learned that telling old firefighters what they cannot do is a poor use of oxygen." At that, a faint, rusty voice came from the bay entrance. "She learns fast." Every head turned. Frank Mallory entered in a wheelchair pushed by an orderly from the hospital. A gray blanket covered his knees. His brown cardigan hung loose over his shoulders, and a nasal cannula still traced across his face. He looked smaller than the photographs, much smaller. But the firehouse changed when he crossed the threshold, not because he filled the room, because the room made space for him. Caleb stepped forward at once, but Frank lifted 2 fingers. "Don't salute me, Dorsey boy. I'll start charging rent." Caleb stopped, smiling despite the wetness in his eyes. "Yes, sir." Ranger rose and went to Frank's chair. The old dog pressed his shoulder lightly against Frank's knee, and Frank's hand found his head without looking down. Alan stared at his father. For the first time, Ethan saw the son and the child in him at once. The child saw a legend. The son saw a burden. The man saw what time had done to both. Frank's wheelchair was placed beside the empty chair, not in it. His coat remained where Ethan had put it, hanging like a version of him that could still stand. Claire sat to Frank's left. Alan and Denise sat across the table. Lily took the far end. Mara remained standing. Ethan leaned against the wall near Ranger, close enough to help if needed, far enough not to own the room. The county investigator introduced herself as Patricia Hale, a woman in her early 60s with silver hair cut to her jaw and reading glasses hanging from a chain. She wore a dark green coat and carried a notebook rather than a badge. Her voice had the calm dryness of someone who had heard every excuse bureaucracy could invent and had run out of surprise years ago. "I am here to observe and clarify next steps," she said. "So this is not a legal hearing, but what is said here may guide formal review." Alan rubbed both hands over his face. "Formal review, investigation, records. Claire, do you understand what this could do?" Claire's answer came quietly. "Yes. To us?" "To him," she said, looking at Frank. "It already did something to him." Denise leaned forward. "No one wanted this. We did not abandon him. That word keeps getting thrown around like everyone here knows what the last 2 years were like." Frank's eyes remained on the table. "Then tell us," Mara said. Denise looked at her, startled by the invitation. Mara's tone held no softness, but no trap either. "Tell us what it was like." Denise's mouth tightened, and because no one shouted at her, she began. She spoke of Frank's fall in the kitchen, of nights when he forgot the stove, of bills, of Alan missing work, of insurance forms that seemed designed by people who hated the desperate, of Frank refusing help, refusing walkers, refusing to move to the downstairs bedroom, of Denise waking at 2 a.m. to a crash and finding him on the floor, furious not because he was hurt, but because someone had seen him unable to rise. Some of it was true. That made it harder. Pain rarely came wearing one person's fingerprints. Alan took over when her voice thinned. "I couldn't do it," he said, staring at the table. "I thought I could. I thought bringing him home after the first hospital stay would be temporary. Then every day became a fight. Pills, meals, bathrooms. He hated me helping him. I hated myself for hating it." Frank closed his eyes. Alan did not look at him. "When St. Bartholomew said they had skilled care, routines, staff, I believed them because I needed to believe them. And when Dad said he hated it there, I told myself he hated everything." Lily lowered her head. Denise added, "We were told visits agitated him." Claire turned sharply. "By who?" "J'attends." Denise hesitated. Alan answered. "Mr. Rusk said Frank did better with consistency. He said family visits could increase confusion." Frank laughed once. It was a dry, painful sound. "Consistency," he whispered. "That what they call being lonely now?" No one answered. Caleb dimmed the lights and started the projector. He did not announce what he was doing. He simply let the wall fill with an old photograph. Frank at 35, standing in front of Engine 2 with his helmet tucked under his arm. Black hair, broad grin, one sleeve torn. A child's soot-streaked hand gripping his coat. Another photograph. Frank and a young Thomas Cole outside the Mercer Street fire, both wrapped in blankets, both alive because stubbornness had met stubbornness in the smoke. Another. Frank carrying an elderly woman through snow after a furnace explosion. Another. Frank sitting on the firehouse floor with 3 children, teaching them how to stop, drop, and roll while making such an exaggerated, serious face that all 3 children were laughing. The images moved across the wall without music. They did not need it. The room supplied its own. Breathing, a quiet sniffle from Lily, the hum of the projector, the small click each time Caleb advanced a slide. Alan watched like a man being forced to look at a son he had built his life trying not to face. When the final image appeared, it showed Frank much older, perhaps late 60s, standing behind a group of new recruits. He was not smiling. One hand rested on the shoulder of a young firefighter. His expression was stern, but proud. Caleb spoke at last. "My father is in this picture," he said. "He told me Frank scared him half to death the first week, then taught him how to stay alive. My father said the first rule Frank gave every recruit was simple. Anoani." Caleb looked at the old man. Frank did not lift his head. Caleb said it for him. "Don't leave anyone behind just because they got quiet." The words crossed the room and stopped at the empty chair. There it was. Not an accusation shouted from a pulpit. A rule. One Frank had lived by. One others had broken around him. Alan's face crumpled, but he fought it. Men like him had spent years learning that tears did not fix bills, did not lift fathers off floors, did not make sons feel less small. "I was afraid," he said. No one spoke. Alan finally looked at Frank. "I was afraid to see you like this. That's the truth. I hated the firehouse when I was a kid because everybody loved you there. Everybody needed you. Everybody had a story about you saving someone. And I was just your son. I didn't know how to compete with burning buildings." Frank's eyes opened. Alan's voice broke in a quiet place. "Then you got old. And I hated that too. Because I thought maybe now you'd finally need me. And when you did, I was angry. I was angry that you weren't the man in the pictures. I was angry that you made me feel weak for being tired." Claire wiped her face silently. Alan looked at the coat on the empty chair. "So I let other people take over. And when it felt wrong, I told myself professionals knew better. When Claire asked about visiting, I said you didn't want it because that made it easier to hear myself say we weren't going." Denise stared down at her hands. "I saw things too," she said. "Not the fire alarms, not all that, but enough. He was thinner. The room smelled damp. He said the staff didn't come when he pressed the button. I thought if we complained too much, they'd ask us to move him. We couldn't afford better. So I made myself practical." Her voice sharpened at herself. Practical is a polite word for cowardly when you use it too long. Frank sat very still. The old firehouse seemed to lean toward him. Everyone waited for forgiveness, because people often mistook confession for payment. Frank did not pay them that cheaply. "You think I wanted to need help?" he asked. Alan shook his head, tears now moving freely, though he made no sound. "You think I liked you seeing me fall? You think I liked forgetting where the damn sugar was? Getting old is losing arguments with your own hands." A breath moved through the room, half pain, half bitter recognition. Frank turned his head toward Alan. "I didn't need you to become me." Alan flinched. "I didn't need you to run into fires. I didn't need you to like the sirens. I didn't even need you to know what to do every time I got worse." Frank's hand trembled on the blanket. Ranger stepped closer, and the old man rested his fingers in the dog's fur. "I needed you to open the door when I knocked." Alan bent forward as if the sentence had passed through his ribs. No one moved to comfort him right away. That too was mercy. Some pain had to be felt before it could become anything better. Patricia Hale closed her notebook softly. "St. Bartholomew will be subject to an immediate safety and care review. Based on the documentation provided, I will recommend temporary protective measures for several residents. Mr. Rusk has been placed on administrative leave pending inquiry." Lily looked up quickly. "What about residents still there?" "We are coordinating transfers where needed. No one will be moved without assessment, but urgent cases will be prioritized." "And staff?" Mara asked. Patricia met Lily's eyes. Retaliation against a cooperating staff member will be documented. Ms. Parker, my office will speak with you separately. Lily nodded, holding herself together with both hands. Caleb added, the fire department is starting voluntary home and elder care safety checks next week. Smoke alarms, exit access, call systems where we can advise. Frank already told me our coffee better improve if we expect seniors to attend. Frank muttered, it's an emergency. A small laugh moved through the room. Not because everything was well, because the living had to breathe somehow. When the meeting ended, people did not rush out. Denise stood first, then sat again. Alan remained across from Frank, eyes swollen, hands clasped so tightly the knuckles blanched. Finally, he stood and came around the table. He stopped a few feet from the wheelchair. Dad, he said. Frank looked up. Alan seemed to shrink and grow older at the same time. I don't know how to fix it. Frank studied him for a long moment. Good, he said. Men who think they can fix everything usually break more. Alan let out a rough, broken breath. What do I do? Frank turned his eyes toward the firehouse bay, toward Engine 2 gleaming under the lights. Start small. Alan followed his gaze. The old truck stood there like a red beast at rest, polished by younger hands but carrying old ghosts in its metal. Frank shifted as if he wanted to rise. Mara moved immediately. No. Frank sighed. Doctor, I survived 40 years of fire and 1 nursing home. Don't let a chair make a liar out of me. Mara looked at Ethan. This is medically irritating. Ethan stepped forward. We'll support him. With Caleb on one side and Ethan on the other, Frank stood. Only for a few seconds. His legs shook. His breath caught. Ranger pressed close to his knee, steady and warm. Alan reached out instinctively, then stopped, afraid to presume. Frank saw the hesitation. Door, he said. Alan blinked. Frank nodded toward the bay door switch near the wall. Open it. Alan crossed the room and pressed the button. The big firehouse door rumbled upward. Cold air entered, smelling of wet pavement, wood smoke from distant chimneys, and evening settling over Red Mill. Frank placed one hand on the side of Engine 2. The red paint reflected his thin fingers, Ranger's dark head, Ethan's field jacket, Alan standing by the open door, Claire holding the matchstick keychain against her chest. For a moment, no one said anything. The town outside went on as towns do. A car passed. A dog barked somewhere down the street. The church bell rang the hour with a tired bronze voice. Frank looked at the engine, not with nostalgia alone, but with farewell and greeting braided together. Then he turned slightly toward Alan. Small enough? He asked. Alan wiped his face with both hands. Yes. Ethan watched them from beside the engine. He understood then that victory did not always arrive with applause, punishment, or a clean ending. Sometimes victory was an old man standing for 10 seconds with a dog braced beside him. Sometimes it was a son opening a door he should have opened months before. Sometimes it was a room full of people finally admitting that neglect had not been one monster, but many small choices wearing ordinary shoes. Frank's knees weakened. Ethan and Caleb eased him back into the wheelchair. Ranger stayed close until the old man was settled. Frank patted the dog's head once. You keep showing up, don't you? Ranger leaned into his hand. Ethan looked at the empty chair inside the common room, the coat still hanging from it, the metal still catching the light. For the first time since returning to Red Mill, he did not feel that the past was chasing him. It was walking beside him, slower than he expected, but still walking. Frank Mallory did not return to St. Bartholomew. That decision was made quietly, with no victory speech and no newspaper photographer standing by the hospital doors. It came through a chain of ordinary, necessary things. Dr. Mara Winslow signing discharge instructions, Patricia Hale arranging temporary protective placement options, Claire calling in favors at school to adjust her schedule, and Alan sitting in a chair across from his father with his hands clasped between his knees, waiting to hear whether he had earned even one small piece of trust back. He had not. Not yet. Frank listened to everyone speak as if they were discussing a house damaged by fire, which in a way they were. There were structures still standing. There were rooms that could perhaps be saved. But there was also smoke in the beams, and anyone who pretended otherwise was a fool. "I can take him home," Alan said. The sentence came out too quickly, like a man trying to pay a debt with a check before anyone checked the account. Frank looked at his son for a long time. Alan did not look away this time. That was something. Not enough, but something. "No," Frank said. One word. No anger behind it. That made it heavier. Denise lowered her eyes. Claire reached for her grandfather's hand, then stopped before touching him, waiting for permission. Ranger, lying by the foot of the hospital bed, lifted his head and watched Frank as though he understood that this was not a medical decision. This was a doorway. Claire's voice was small but steady. "Grandpa, I want you with me." "I do. But my apartment has stairs, and I'm gone most of the day with school. I can take leave for a while, but not forever." "I know, little matchstick." The nickname still broke something open in her face every time he used it. Mara tapped her pen against the discharge folder. "He needs home health visits, medication monitoring, breathing checks, fall prevention. Someone around, especially at night, at least until we know how well he recovers." Ethan had been standing near the window, silent. He had not planned to speak. That was becoming a pattern he did not trust. But some words lined themselves up behind his ribs and refused to leave him alone. "My father's house is empty," he said. Everyone looked at him, even Frank. Ethan kept his eyes on the gray sky beyond the glass. "One floor can be set up for him. Bedroom near the bathroom. No stairs needed. I'm there. Ranger's there. Home health can come by. Mara can check on him." Mara raised an eyebrow. "I enjoy being volunteered by men with lung irritation." "You were going to check on him anyway." "I was. I prefer the illusion of free will." Frank's mouth twitched. Ethan turned from the window. It would be temporary. Frank snorted weakly. That word is how people get stuck with cats, house guests, and church committees. "I don't own a cat, and I don't attend committees. Yet." Claire looked between them, hope rising too quickly for comfort. "Grandpa?" Frank looked at Ethan with narrowed eyes. "I'm not charity. No. I'm not a project. No. I'm not some old relic you're putting in your father's house because of a letter." The room went still. Ethan absorbed that cleanly. Frank had earned the right to be sharp. "No," Ethan said again. "You're a man who needs a safe place to recover. I have a safe place that has been too quiet for years. That is the whole offer." Frank studied him. "And what do you get?" Ethan glanced at Ranger. The old dog yawned loudly, then put his head back down as if the negotiations bored him. "Someone to complain about my coffee," Ethan said. Frank blinked. Mara looked down at the folder to hide a smile. Ethan continued. "Someone to tell Ranger stories he can sleep through. Someone to make the floorboards less smug about being the loudest thing in the house." Frank looked toward the dog. He snores? Like a generator with moral problems. Ranger's ear flicked. Frank let out a thin laugh that became a cough. Mara moved, but he waved her off. For the first time since the fire, the room held something like warmth without needing to apologize for it. Frank looked at Alan. You come by. Alan nodded quickly. Yes. Not to perform guilt. Alan swallowed. No. You fix things. Drive Claire when she needs it. Learn the medications. And if you don't know what to say, don't fill the room with nonsense. Alan's eyes reddened. I can do that. Denise lifted her gaze. I can help with the medication chart. Frank looked at her. Denise did not shrink, but her voice changed. Less polished, more human. I should have learned it before. Frank did not forgive her, but he did not refuse the sentence either. That was how the arrangement began. Not with forgiveness, with instructions. The old house on Sycamore Road received Frank Mallory 3 days later. Ethan had delayed the listing indefinitely. The real estate agent had sounded puzzled, then relieved in the professional tone of someone who knew commissions weighted better than people did. Alan installed grab bars in the bathroom before Frank arrived. He measured twice, drilled once, then redid the left bar because Ethan stood behind him in silence until Alan admitted it was crooked. Denise labeled the medication organizer in careful block letters. Claire brought a quilt from her apartment, one she said Frank's wife had made years ago. She carried it folded against her chest like a rescued flag. Mara inspected the bedroom and declared it not criminal, which Ethan chose to accept as praise. Frank arrived in a borrowed wheelchair, wearing his brown cardigan and a flat cap someone from the firehouse had dropped off at the hospital. His old firehouse coat came with him, folded across his lap. Ranger met him at the front door and sniffed the wheels, the blanket, the coat, then Frank's hand. Well, Frank said, looking into the hallway, house hasn't run away yet. Ethan stood beside the door. It considered it. Smart house. The first week was not beautiful in the way people liked stories to be beautiful. It was awkward. Frank hated the hospital bed Ethan rented and called it a machine built by people who never loved furniture. He refused oatmeal twice. He argued with the home health nurse about whether prune juice was medicine or punishment. He tried to stand without help one morning and nearly fell, which earned him a lecture from Mara so precise and devastating that Ethan silently decided never to become her patient voluntarily. Ranger adjusted faster than anyone. He learned Frank's schedule by the second day. He walked beside the wheelchair without crowding it. At night, he slept in the hallway between Frank's room and Ethan's. A dark shape stretched across the boards, like a bridge no one had asked for, but everyone used. One evening, the first small snow of the season fell over Red Mill. Not enough to cover the road. Just enough to brighten the edges of the porch and settle in the bare branches behind the house. Ethan made coffee too strong for any sane person and brought one mug to the living room, where Frank sat in Thomas Cole's old armchair with a blanket over his legs. Frank took one sip and grimaced. You boil this in a boot? Yes. Whose? Classified. Frank nodded gravely. Explains the aftertaste. Ethan sat on the edge of the sofa. Ranger lay between them, apparently asleep. The house was not quiet anymore. That fact kept surprising Ethan. It was not loud. Frank did not fill it with constant talk. But the house had gained a second rhythm, the soft click of a cane against the floor when Frank practiced walking short distances. The whistle of the kettle Claire used when she visited after school. Alan's tools knocking in the mudroom as he fixed the loose back step. Denise's voice from the kitchen, asking Mara whether the blue pill came before food or after. Ordinary sounds, the kind that made rooms less like memorials. One afternoon, Ethan found Frank on the porch with Ranger beside him, both of them facing the woods. Frank had a wool blanket over his shoulders and his firehouse coat folded on the chair next to him. The air smelled faintly of pine and wood smoke from a neighbor's chimney. Ranger was trembling, not badly, just enough. Frank noticed before Ethan did. The old man lowered his hand and rested it against Ranger's neck. "Stove smoke bothering you?" Ranger pressed closer to the chair. Frank's eyes narrowed toward the woods, but his hand stayed gentle. "Yeah," he said. "I know." Ethan stopped in the doorway. He had seen Ranger comfort others. He had seen the dog steady Frank, calm Claire, watch over frightened residents. He had not expected to see Frank return the favor. The old firefighter did not coo. He did not make a fuss. He simply sat there, one scarred hand on the dog's neck, breathing slowly until Ranger's trembling eased. "Smoke lies," Frank told the dog. "Makes you think every fire is the same one." Ranger let out a long breath. Ethan looked down at his father's watch. For years, he had believed healing meant becoming the man he used to be before the damage. But maybe that was nonsense. Burned wood did not become unburned. Scar tissue did not turn back into untouched skin. Maybe healing was learning which smoke belonged to now, and which belonged to then. The weeks changed them in small, stubborn ways. Claire came every Tuesday and Friday, sometimes more. She brought student drawings for Frank, who judged them with the seriousness of a museum curator, and once declared a crayon fire truck mechanically impossible but spiritually accurate. She hung 2 photographs in the hallway. Frank as a young firefighter beside Engine 2, and Thomas Cole wrapped in a blanket after the Mercer Street fire. Between them, she placed the little wooden matchstick on a small shelf. Alan came on Saturdays. At first, he arrived carrying too many apologies and not enough tools. Frank ignored most of the apologies, so Alan learned to bring practical offerings instead. Weather stripping for the back door, new batteries for smoke detectors, a repaired porch rail, a bag of coffee beans after Frank accused Ethan of committing crimes against breakfast. Denise came less often, but when she did, she came prepared. She brought medication charts, soup divided into labeled containers, and once, unexpectedly, a box of old family photographs she had saved, but never sorted. She and Frank remained careful with each other, like people walking across ice they both knew could crack. No miracle arrived. That was the mercy of it. Miracles asked too little of people. This asked them to return, again and again. St. Bartholomew changed too, though not quickly enough for anyone's anger. Glenn Rusk remained on administrative leave while investigators reviewed staffing records, maintenance delays, and care notes. Several residents were moved to safer facilities. Mrs. Agnes was placed in a home where her hearing needs were actually written into her daily care plan. Lily gave her statement, kept her job for the moment, and was offered a position at another care center by a supervisor who had heard what she did. At the firehouse, Caleb began the elder safety program with a sign that read, "No one too old to matter. No house too small to check." Frank called the slogan too sentimental, then insisted the font be larger. By early winter, Frank was strong enough to visit the station again. The day was clear and cold. New recruits gathered in the bay, standing in a loose semicircle with cups of firehouse coffee and expressions that tried to look casual in front of history. Frank sat in his wheelchair beside Engine 2. Ranger lay at his feet wearing a red bandana Caleb had tied around his collar. The bandana bore the Red Mill Fire Department patch. Ranger tolerated it with the grave disappointment of a decorated general forced into a party hat. Frank noticed and pointed. "That dog outranks half of you." One recruit laughed too loudly, then stopped when no one else did. Frank looked at them for a long moment. "You want advice?" he said. No one answered, which was the correct answer. Good. Advice is usually what old men call revenge. That loosened the room. Frank's voice was rough but steady enough. Courage isn't not being scared. Any man who tells you he's never scared is either lying or too stupid to trust with a hose. Courage is hearing somebody call from where you don't want to go and deciding their life matters more than your comfort. He rested one hand on Ranger's head. And when the calling gets quiet, listen harder. People don't stop needing help because they've stopped making noise. The recruits stood differently after that, straighter. Not because Frank commanded them, but because truth, spoken by someone who had paid for it, had weight. That evening, snow began again. Soft this time, generous. It fell over Ethan's porch, over the repaired steps, over the dark woods beyond the house. The world seemed to lower its voice. Frank sat wrapped in a wool blanket in the porch chair, a knit cap pulled over his thin white hair. Ranger lay with his head on Frank's slipper, the red bandana still around his neck. Ethan stood nearby with 2 mugs of coffee, one drinkable, one made to Frank's suspicious specifications. From the road, headlights approached. Alan's truck. He got out carrying a small toolbox, though Ethan had not asked him to fix anything that day. Claire climbed down from the passenger side with a paper bag from the bakery. Denise followed, holding a thermos and looking uncertain, but present. Frank watched them come up the path. He did not smile broadly. He was not that kind of man, but his hand moved once over Ranger's head, and the dog's tail thumped against the porch board. Ethan handed Frank a mug. "Too hot?" Ethan asked. Frank sipped. "Too weak." "You told me weaker. I was testing you. Did I pass?" "No." Ethan nodded. Good to have consistency. Frank looked toward the road as distant sirens rose somewhere in town. A fire engine, maybe. An ambulance. Some other urgent thing moving through someone else's life. The sound cut across the snow. Ranger lifted his head. Frank did too. For a moment, the old man's eyes caught the last light of evening, and they brightened like coals stirred under ash. He could no longer run toward the siren. His knees would not carry him. His lungs would protest. His hands, once strong enough to drag men through smoke, now trembled when the cold deepened. But the torch had not gone out. It had moved into Caleb and his recruits, into Claire, who had learned that love sometimes meant questioning the people who raised you, into Alan, who was learning to open doors before regret had to knock, into Denise, who had discovered that practical help without tenderness was only half a bridge, into Lily, who had found her voice, into Ethan, who had stopped trying to sell the house where his father's silence lived and begun filling it with living noise, and into Ranger, old soldier, old rescuer, old keeper of the command scratched into metal at his throat. Find one more. Frank lowered his hand to the dog's head. "You hear that?" he asked. Ranger's ears tilted toward the siren. Ethan stood beside them, warm mugs in his hands, snow on his shoulders, the old Hamilton watch ticking beneath his cuff. "I hear it," Ethan said. Frank leaned back, eyes on the falling snow. "Good," he murmured. "Means somebody's still answering." No one spoke after that. They did not need to. The porch held them all. The old firefighter, the retired SEAL, the dog with silver on his muzzle, the son learning to return, the granddaughter who had refused the easy lie, and the house that had once been waiting only to be sold. Beyond the trees, Red Mill glowed under winter lights. Behind them, through the front window, two photographs watched over the hallway. Thomas Cole and Frank Mallory. Two men joined long ago by smoke, stubbornness, and the borrowed years between them. Frank was not the town's forgotten man anymore. He was not merely a patient, not a burden, not a file. At Ethan's house, he became something stranger and holier than any title the county could print. He became the man who reminded them where home began. And on that snowy porch, with Ranger sleeping at his feet and Ethan standing close enough to stay, Frank Mallory smiled at last. Not because everything had been repaired, but because the door was open, and for now everyone who mattered had come through it. Sometimes, the people who once carried others through fire are the very ones most easily forgotten when their own strength fades. Frank's story reminds us that gratitude should not wait until someone is gone. A visit, a phone call, a chair pulled close beside a bed. These may look small, but in God's quiet way, they can become the door someone has been praying would open. May we notice the elders in our lives before silence hides them from us. May we honor the hands that once protected us, and may we have the courage to find one more person who needs to know they are not alone. If this story touched your heart, please share your thoughts in the comments. And if you'd like more stories of loyalty, healing, and hope, consider subscribing to the channel. May peace be with you and your family tonight.